morning and welcome to The Skinny for Friday, March 20th. I'm Mitch Perry, the senior political reporter for the Florida Phoenix, joined by my partner once again here in the studio for the first time in a long time, editor-in-chief of Creative Living newspaper, Ray Roa. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Mitch. So good to have both of us in here. It's cool, man.
Yeah, no, actually, officially 4 weeks ago, right, when we had the fundraiser, I was down here, but I had to come in the middle of the show because I had a doctor's appointment. Right. So first time, like regularly since I left to go to Tallahassee back in early January. So we're going to get into that, by the way, with our guest coming up here in a few minutes. But how you doing, man? You were also, I should say that you were at Cafe Con Tampa this morning, the weekly public affairs discussion breakfast session.
Yeah, I love Cafe Con Tampa because it's at 8 in the morning.
Right.
So you know everybody that's there is super serious. We were talking about our Tampa Bay journalism project, of which WMNF News is a part, and discussing the idea of non-paywall journalism and all the little nuances. And it was a really great discussion, great group. We love being out and we love talking about that. I mean, you know, Cafe Con Tampa is great, and it's a busy day if you're into civics in Tampa. Tampa Tiger Bay is today.
That's right.
Hillsborough County School Board candidates will be out there. We have some candidates walking around the station right now for different offices. It's a really lively day here at WMNF.
I was in Ybor this morning, and of course we have the NCAA tournament
That's
taking
right.
place.
So many police escorts all over town, right? Have you noticed this?
I have not seen that. Hey, but you know, we're going to later in the show. We're also, you might be, if you're following news out of Washington D.C., there's been a lot of talk about the U.S. Senate beginning consideration of the Save America Act, which is a sweeping election overhaul that would introduce new proof of citizenship requirements to vote among its provisions. And that we have our own version of that here in Florida, actually. That bill has been sent to Ron DeSantis. We're going to talk to a voting rights advocate about that later in the show. But first, let's get into talking about the legislative session, which officially did end. The 60-day session.
When are you going to get called back to Tallahassee?
Right. Well, we don't know, actually, when the session's going back in terms of like passing a budget, which is like officially the only thing that they're required to do. But we're going to speak with one of the Democrat representative who has been there this past year and has been there for the last 8 years to discuss all this. And that is joining us via Zoom from Orlando is Democratic State Representative Anna Eskamani. Good morning, Rep. Eskamani.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Great to have you here with us, Anna. A lot to talk to you about, of course. But first of all, I want to actually, if I could get a little personal with you, you are probably one of the more high-profile Iranian Americans in Florida, actually, being a prominent member of the Florida House for the last 8 years. Of course, tomorrow marks 3 full weeks since the U.S. and Israel launched a joint attack on Iran. That continues, and we don't know, of course, when this war is going to end. You know, just if I could ask you, I think you have family members in Iran. Can you tell us how you're dealing with all this?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's been very difficult. And I should also make note that the Persian New Year is today and tomorrow as well with the spring equinox. And so it's a very complicated time for the Iranian diaspora and for, of course, our family in Iran. Candidly, I've not been able to speak to my family in about 2 weeks now. For those who are in Iran, they are stuck between a regime that does not care about them, that is suppressing their ability to communicate, their ability to express viewpoints of diverse opinions. And of course, they're also facing bombardment. And it creates a painful ecosystem where many Iranians initially welcomed any type of intervention because, remember, this took place after months of protests in Iran for regime change. But of course, I think more and more members of the community have begun to realize that any type of foreign intervention is an incredibly dangerous decision to make. And I think President Trump, per usual, underestimated just the consequences, the unintended consequences of his actions, where, of course, now we see not only no clear path to a democratic Iran, but, of course, energy costs going up, environmental disaster through bombardment, destabilization of the entire region. And as an elected official, it's my duty and responsibility to uphold the U.S. Constitution. And so I'm really proud of those that voted in favor of the War Powers Act. But of course, we know that at this point, stopping President Trump just seems to be an exercise of no results, when it comes to holding him accountable for operating in such a unilateral way.
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to get your thoughts about that. Let's talk about the legislative session. In fact, let's go backward or start at the end, if we will. Last Friday was the last day of the session, and I want to talk about that because in the final hours there, you were trying to attempt something legislatively that I think would have been really crucial to have happen, and that is you were trying to get basically language from a bill that was passed in the Senate, actually Pinellas County Senator Nick DeSeglie's bill 840, which unanimously passed the Senate, but there was never legislation in the House. That bill, that may not be familiar to listeners at all when you hear those numbers, but it was actually a correction of sorts to DeSeglie's 2025 bill, SB 180, which I think a lot of people have heard of, which limits local government's ability to impose land use restrictions on development in the wake of major storms. That was, I believe that bill had good intentions a year ago. DeSeglie filed it after all the problems with local governments and the storms that we had here in the fall of 2024. But it also had some very onerous restrictions on local governments that I know you're dealing with out there in Orange County. And you tried this a couple of times, Rep. Escamani, to try to get the House to pick up this language, including last week on the floor, where they basically had to temporarily postpone everything to try to figure out how they could throw your action out of order. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I mean, it definitely was a very incredible way to end my last session, that is for sure. And you provide a really great context and background. And to operationalize this, basically the consequences of two parts of Senate Bill 180, Section 18 and 28, have been weaponized by developers and special interests to basically supersede and eliminate comprehensive plans for local government across the state of Florida. Orange County is experiencing that. In fact, we spent years in hosting public meetings, doing research, county commission meetings to craft what is called Vision 2050 for Orange County to modernize our zoning. And this is now indefinitely on pause for implementation because of Senate Bill 180. And so the Florida Senate, as you noted, saw this as a problem, worked to address it, passed the fixer, Senate Bill 840, unanimously in a bipartisan manner, but the Florida House never moved on it. And so I took it upon myself to try to force a vote on this issue because I know that Republicans agree with me overwhelmingly. In fact, the emails that I have received in support of my efforts have overwhelmingly come from places like Manatee County, Volusia County, and counties across the state where local residents have no tools available to them to determine the future of what their neighborhoods feel like and what their communities look like. And as you noted, this is my second attempt to do so. My first attempt, I just took Senate Bill 840 and filed it as an amendment on another bill, House Bill 399, which is titled Land Use Management. So it's a very broad piece of policy, the perfect vehicle for related amendments. And that first attempt, the Speaker's office actually moved Senate Bill 840, a Senate bill, into a House committee with no hearing. And they leveraged that maneuver to say that I was out of order because I'm not allowed to file an amendment on a topic that is a bill that's never gone a hearing in the House. And again, this bill never was filed in the House. So as of Monday morning, I was in order. By Monday afternoon, I was out of order, just based on that maneuver.
And let me ask you, I'm sorry, Anna. Again, we're speaking with Democratic Representative Anna Escamani from the Orlando area. I was shocked that there was no companion bill to this filed in the House because, as we both know, this SB 180 from a year ago has been over 24 local governments have sued about this. This is a problem up and down the state, and the Senate, obviously, Republicans, Democrats alike thought this was a serious problem. They voted unanimously to try to pass corrective parts of that, and yet in the House, you couldn't even get one representative to file a bill that would be a companion measure. I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think there were some comparable bills that were very localized to someone's county or district, but you're right, there was not ever an equivalent. And I can only assume, as a member of the Minority Caucus, I don't have all of the insights from the majority office. What I can assume is that the Speaker was not going to give such bill a hearing.
Right.
And thus, we only have 7 bill slots, so don't waste your time on it, right? Now, for me, in the context of the tools that I have available to me, amendments are an option. And my second attempt was a little bit more subtle because it took place, as you noted, the last day of session during messages, which is basically where a bill moves, it bounces between the House and the Senate until we get a version that we both agree to. And I just never have seen anything like this where the speaker calls an informal recess abruptly while I'm closing out an amendment. I've just never seen that before. And so, of course, on the House floor, when that happened, I was pushing my colleagues across the aisle on allowing the amendment to move forward because it is 100% relevant to the bill. And of course, it's an issue that everyone cares about. Everybody. The only entities that don't like it are the developers who are exploiting it. And when it comes to not just protecting smart growth, but really protecting our environment, we have to get this fixed. And will share that in conversations with the speaker designate, the next speaker of the Florida House, he has told me that this will be something that he wants to prioritize. So that does give me at least a little bit of hope. And I think, our efforts to start the conversation to force the vote, despite being blocked both times, it still sets a foundation for the pressure to be kept on. And that's very important for constituents across the state of Florida, despite this issue being a little more wonky, right? Because I think most of the headlines you read about in the paper are going to focus on the culture war issues, some of the more social issues. But this impacts every part of your life, from public transportation systems to housing affordability to environmental conservation to water quality. And so it's really important to continue to put the pressure and to be an advocate on it.
Absolutely. Again, if you're just tuning in to The Skinny here, Mitch Perry, Ray Rowe, we're speaking with the Orlando Democratic Representative Anas Kamani about the legislative session that is kind of completed, but it's not, obviously. We'll talk about that briefly. But let's talk about some of the bills that went through, that some of the issues that I know that you very much oppose. One of those, of course, is a bill that would prohibit local governments from funding, promoting, or taking official actions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. DEI, of course, and it says actually local elected officials who violate this law commit malfeasance or misfeasance, which could result in the governor removing them from office. As someone who aspires to be Orlando's next mayor, how are you going to handle this if you're elected next year?
Well, I will say that this bill, likely soon to be law, is unconstitutional. And I suspect there will be litigation filed, primarily because it censors the First Amendment rights of elected officials. The way the bill is written is essentially says that if you, in your quote, official capacity, attend a event or a cultural gathering that is not permissible under this new law, that, to your point, you would be accused of malfeasance to the point where you might get removed from your office. And that is a direct violation of the First Amendment. So I do think it's important that we fight this as much as we can. Now, the context of application of its current form, it will be a blanket of censorship among local governments across the state of Florida. The bill carves out types of diversity that is acceptable by the state, and then creates vagueness in what is not acceptable. And that is by design, because again, it's not even just censorship; it's also permission to speak on what the state gives you permission to speak on. So it's promotion of the speech that they like while censoring the speech that they don't. And as mayor of Orlando, my focus will always be on harm mitigation. I think it's really important to get creative. And how do we follow the status of the law, again, pending this legislation and potential litigation, but also continue the good work of serving a diverse community in the confines of what that law says and doesn't say. So this is where it's very important to work in a collaborative way with advocacy organizations, with cultural groups, with your city council, with your general counsel, to map out, what's the framework where we can't operate within and what's the framework that we can. It also reminds me of the Representative Snyder and Jacques bill on clean energy and net zero policies.
Right.
And it's a similar vein, right? This bill prohibits local governments from engaging in any net zero policies around trying to reduce your carbon footprint and so forth. I asked very specific questions on the House floor about this bill that I ultimately voted no on, but I was in the process able to at least get clarity on what is allowed, not allowed, and based on an amendment add to this bill in one of its committee stops, energy efficiency programs that save consumers money should still be permissible. And that includes solar programs and so forth. So part of the job of a lawmaker is to mitigate that harm in the crafting of legislation and in the questions we ask and the points we make also oftentimes lead to litigation. But your job as an executive is to ensure that when you are having to follow these laws, they do it in a way that mitigates harm for your community as much as possible. And that will always be my focus in everything that I do.
Right.
Rep. Escamani, let me go back a little bit to the DEI element. You talked about the mechanics of it. Orlando Pride, obviously, around October. Tampa Pride would have been this month, and there's stuff going on with that. St. Pete Pride in the summer. It's something we're talking about in our shop, trying to figure it out, and you kind of hit on it. This could very well be one of the last Pride seasons where elected officials can just show up without these kind of fears and consequences. Obviously, you're talking about a ton of things, besides this up there. But what are those conversations? I mean, you're talking about a community that's used to seeing its elected officials riding in cars, even sheriffs, throwing beads, meeting the community. But we're looking at a future possibly where they can't even say that they're an elected official. What does that look like? And when you're talking to fellow elected officials, what are their plans? Like, are they scared to show up? How are they going to show up for the LGBTQ plus community outside of that harm mitigation that you talked about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, this is why I think litigating this law is so important, because the criteria they're establishing, from my perspective, is a clear First Amendment violation. But to take your question to heart, and assuming that litigation takes time and we're in this situation with upcoming Pride events, it's incredibly concerning. I mean, first of all, Orlando Pride, which I have attended proudly since I was a college student at UCF back in 2010, takes place in a public park. It takes place with the support of not just local elected officials, but of course the infrastructure provided by public safety officials, with the support of Parks and Rec staff. And there's so much public input and engagement and kind of resources that help to make a Pride event successful. So what the bill does is set a restriction that you cannot participate in your, quote, official capacity. And so from my perspective, and again, I'm a state representative still, so these restrictions don't apply to me, but they would apply to me in my capacity as a municipal leader. You can attend these events, but you can't denote that you're elected official. I mean, it's just so silly and impossible, right? It's as if I walk into Pride, and if someone calls me mayor, I have to duck and hide. I mean, that's just how absurd and obscene, right? Like the legislation really is. But ultimately, the dynamics that would be more literal, and more obvious, is going to be if you're spending any type of public money, you cannot do that anymore. So if you're walking in the parade and you sponsor the parade, with your maybe a CRA or some sort of public avenue, maybe OUC, a municipal utility like we have, might sponsor an event like Pride, you will not be allowed to do that. And so you would have to spend personal funds to participate. But even if you did that, you cannot use your title. So I mean, it's just so silly, and again, nearly impossible to follow without being attacked anyways. And that's a really important dynamic here, because with the right-wing trolls on social media, they will spread misinformation. They will edit what you say. I mean, they've done it to me many times. And it just speaks to how we're in this new era of politics where truth is subjective. You have AI, creating fake, realistic content. And anyone who opposes you is looking for a reason to attack you, and will make up that reason, even if it's not true. So you really can't operate in fear. And I think that's a really important aspect for any elected official. And it's something that I take very seriously, is that I cannot operate in fear. And so there's always risk in anything that I do. There is risk, but I cannot respond because of risk. I have to respond to do what's right for my community and for the oath that I took when I got elected. And that's going to be my focus and my commitment, regardless of what laws move around me.
you're, like many legislators, you're somebody, when they talk, you can feel how much they love their job and the mechanics of it and doing all the homework and getting in there and really trying to get as much work done with the window that they have. And obviously you're going to be trying out for a new job here. You may be called back to Tallahassee to do some more work here, but you are moving on. And I'm wondering, what are the things that kind of keep you up at night that you wish you would have been able to finish or get across the finish line? What are some of those things that make you blurt out expletives, when you think about leaving Tallahassee, and what kind of FOMO are you going to have?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I think the aspect that breaks my heart the most is, despite being 8 years in Florida legislature, I feel like the state has gotten more extreme, more polarized, and more people are struggling than ever to make ends meet. And that is very frustrating, especially as someone who comes from a working class family. As you noted, we work incredibly hard at Team Ana, as do many of members of my caucus, in solving problems that our communities face and spending our own money to help people in need. I work a day job on top of being a lawmaker. And so you're constantly just navigating a balance of time and trying to solve as many problems as possible. And it's just like that, vicious cycle, right? You solve one problem, another one is created, whether it's a manufactured issue or a real issue, you still have to address it. So that is, it can be very demoralizing. And you can also experience compassion fatigue. And I'm always taking pride in the fact that regardless of the ecosystem around me, we still operate as a tender, happy warrior. And we're very committed to the future of this state. And it's why I've never left Florida. I'm born and raised here. And, I've dug my heels deeper in the sand when it comes to my public service and my commitment to my community. But I think that's what is most frustrating is, we always talk about a meritocracy, and hard work delivers good results. And I work incredibly hard. And yet the ecosystem around me is not really changing in the direction that I think it should, right? But for me, that's more of a reason to keep going versus a reason to give up. When it comes to FOMO and just looking back these past 8 years, there's so many unsung heroes in the legislative process, and a lot of folks that agree with you, even if they can't say it and they can't necessarily push policy in that way. But the relationships that I have built these past 8 years are going to continue with me, whether it's with the advocates on the ground who lead on the good fight on issues like voter suppression or reproductive health or LGBT plus equality or economic policy and good tax policy. I serve as a ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, the State Affairs Committee, and the staff in those committees have been wonderful to work with. And they're practitioners, they're experts in their fields. And so when I look back at all the relationships that I've built, I know it's going to serve me well in my next chapter, primarily because I'm going to know how to navigate a hostile environment as a strong Democrat. It's important to be able to do that. But I'm also hopeful that we can change the rhetoric, right? Because a successful Orlando, a successful Tampa, a successful St. Pete is a successful Florida. Our regions are the largest economic drivers for the whole state of Florida. The revenue generated out of Orange County is used to subsidize the rural, more conservative counties. So the state only works because we work together, and I'm going to continue to lead in that way. And I've built the grit and the grace of my approach into politics from trial by fire in the Florida legislature. And so I'm eternally grateful that folks have trusted me to do this work. And I do feel like I've grown as a more effective advocate and leader in these past 8 years. And I obviously hope to continue to learn and grow in that way.
If you're just tuning in right now, you're listening to Skinny here on WMNF 88.5 FM. I'm Mitch Perry with Ray Rowe. It's 11:30 a.m. We're speaking with Orlando Democratic Representative Ana Eskamani. Ana, just a few more minutes with you if we could. And I want to come back to some legislation that I know that you've had issues with as the Democratic caucus. One of those is going to be, or that is right now, is that was passed by a former Democrat turned Republican Representative Hillary Cassell from Dania Beach, is to empower essentially I guess it's the head of the FDLE, is the way the bill says. It designate a domestic or foreign terrorist organization if the group meets specified criteria. And that bill is going to the governor's desk. And this has raised a whole bunch of hackles, including from some former Republicans. I saw your former colleague, Doc Rudman. I follow him on Twitter, and he's all concerned. He says this could backfire against Republicans if there's ever a Democratic governor. We're giving, of course, the governor through the FDLE head and then the cabinet the power to name a domestic terrorist organization here in the state of Florida. And I know you spoke out a lot about this. There's a lot of concerns when this happens on college campuses. Gosh knows we've had a lot of uproars on college campuses over the last few years, going back to the Hamas attack on Israel back in 2023. This is really an interesting and very troublesome bill. A lot of people believe. Your thoughts here?
Incredibly concerning. And again, I think the theme of this legislative session has been ignoring the First Amendment. And the way this bill is written, first of all, it's a reflection of the national rhetoric we've seen, where DHS and ICE, with no shame, accuses protesters as being domestic terrorists, to a point where they are trying to defend their actions in killing those protesters, i.e. Alex Preddy and Nicole Good. So we cannot look at these policies without looking at the greater context of the environment we are in today, and the misinformation and just the weaponization of government agencies against us, right? This bill is a next chapter, next iteration of that. And it gives the Florida cabinet, a body that is not an expert on national security or terror mitigation, it gives them the power to decide what organizations are domestic terrorists. And it just reeks with abuse, to a point where any organization that expresses a viewpoint opposition to the state could be defined as a terrorist organization, and not only subjected to this label, which obviously is disastrous for any organization, but then they're restricted from their ability to use any type of public resource. And if you're a student that, quote, promotes this organization, which could include even making a statement about this organization, you could be expelled. So that, and the bill goes a step farther to explicitly target Muslim day schools, to say that if you're a institution, a private school based on the Muslim faith, that you may not qualify for vouchers. And obviously, I voted no on the expansion of universal vouchers. I don't think public money should be going to private schools with no accountability. But at the same time, if Christian schools and Jewish schools can receive this funding, there's no reason why a Muslim school can't. And they're explicitly carving out Muslim schools. And so it's a terrible bill. It will be litigated. And there are legitimate approaches to keeping the public safe. This is purely political, and that's why I opposed it.
Rep. Kamani, we have one of our callers, David, who wants to ask you a question about Republican politics and overall, but I think it's about the GOP race. David, you're on the Skinny here. Good morning.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Good morning. I just want to say Anna's my brother's rep in Orlando, and he always speaks highly of you. So you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you. I was just curious, do you think that Casey DeSantis will run for governor? It seems like she's kind of running low on time to do it. And I think of her as like the Lady Macbeth of Florida, kind of running things behind the scenes, maybe.
Well said. Yeah, great question.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I know there are DeSantis donors that still want her to run and are still maintaining whisper campaigns in that effort. But I agree with you that I think, one, the Hope Florida controversy has really damaged her. And that's their fault, for engaging in illegal behavior. And for those that don't remember this story, it's basically the DeSantis administration took $10 million in an ACA settlement for Medicaid and moved it to the Hope Florida nonprofit, which is run by the First Lady, and then routed that money towards political campaigns against the ballot initiatives previous election cycle. That has really damaged her image to the point where every day someone asks me about the Hope Florida controversy and sees it as a Casey DeSantis project. And so I do think that has tarnished her image to run. With that said, Governor DeSantis has not made a clear endorsement. I mean, we can assume that Jay Collins, lieutenant governor, would potentially be a pick for him. But
I think we can assume that that's not happening actually on at this
Right.
point. Yeah.
Right. I was going to say,
Yeah.
I mean, his race is flailing as well. And, obviously we have kind of newcomers that have been problematic in their campaign but are attracting younger audiences.
Right.
And so it's a very unpredictable environment. Honestly, I think it's Byron Donalds' race to lose.
Well,
right?
let me ask you about this. Here in Tampa, I saw Jerry Demings, of course, the mayor of Orange County last night, who was one of the two major Democrats running for governor, along with former Pinellas Congressman, GOP Congressman David Jolly. Have you endorsed in that race? Will you endorse in that race?
That's a great question. I have not yet, and I think I need to at some point, but I'm honestly still watching the landscape. There also could be more candidates that file, especially on the NPA side. There's been rumors here in Central Florida around Desmond Meade.
Oh, really? Okay,
Correct.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. And so I'm in a wait and see juncture, while also, of course, building power. Like, we're registering people to vote. We're knocking on doors.
When is the election for Orlando mayor, by the way? When is that happening?
My election is not till November of 2027.
Okay, wow, okay.
But we've already knocked on 48,000 doors, and I've raised more than $1 million, and we're, very committed to running a full-time race despite the marathon, not sprint mentality. However, of course, my operations are a key part of Orange County infrastructure, and so we carry a lot of other folks along the way, and I take pride in my ability to help folks do that, and I want to make sure that we have a good bench for my seat as I lead the legislature, but of course other seats around me as well.
It's so interesting, by the way, you representing Orlando, because as we talk about here, we're in the Tampa Bay area, of course, and we've seen, and as you've seen, since you got elected in 2018, how the state has transmogrified to become one of the biggest red states in the country. And yet it seems to me, when I look at Monique Worrell getting reelected in Orange and Osceola counties in fall of 2024, whereas Andrew Warren did not get reelected here in Hillsborough, that Orlando has really stood out, maybe in Orange County overall, as being one of the bluer spots in Florida that has really remained, that have even gotten bigger in that, where we see the rest of the state getting redder.
Well, and it's not a coincidence. We work very hard in Orange County to increase turnout, to build efficacy. We have already scheduled our first post-legislative session review on the 31st of March. I do my best to keep voters informed, because I believe firmly that when you are informed, then you will see the value of voting and engaging in the system. When a system is so broken to the point where everyday voters don't want to protect it by voting for characters like President Trump, that for me is that's a fault that I carry, right? It's my responsibility to make sure that voters understand the importance of electing people to make a broken system actually work. I can't defend the broken system. What I can commit to is to fix it for you. And that's the only way you can have everyday voters believe in government again, is if government is seen as a tool to make your life better, not harder. And that's on us as elected officials to promote that reality, to promote that vision, versus always being reactive and always defending a system. We should admit the fact that the system is broken, but it's broken because who's in power today. And if we elect new people, we can change it. I
know we got to let you go, but one last question for you, and that is, I know you probably saw the comments by some of the conservative Republican sheriffs this week about immigration, actually. Ron DeSantis was asked, actually, I was the one who asked him about it yesterday here in Bradenton. But what are your thoughts about that? Because we've seen, of course, what's been happening with ICE over the last 14 months since the Trump administration came back into power. And this seemed to be the first rebuke by somebody that Ron DeSantis would respect, who basically said the way that the federal government's going about this immigration mass deportation situation here is really not acceptable.
Well, I never thought I'd come to a moment where I could say that I agree with Sheriff Grady Judd. I mean, that is just,
what a time to be alive.
I know. And I saw Creative Loafing had a really great headline about that too. But I think it's twofold, right? One is the politics of it. Polling on Trump's immigration enforcement and policies is underwater. Voters overwhelmingly agree that he's gone too far, that he's misappropriating funds, and this is not reflective of what they want the country to look and feel like. And it breaks my heart, but the murders of Alex Preddy and Nicole Good, no doubt, played a role in that reflection of opinion. And so when we approach the midterm elections, I mean, let's be clear, right? This is all about holding on to power and pivoting away from a policy they all co-signed and they all benefited from, now singing a different tune because they see that it's not popular as we approach November elections. The other side of this coin, though, right, is the economic reality of it. Florida's top economies are tourism, agriculture, and construction. And you have been not just demonizing the core workforce of these economies, but you are detaining them, you are deporting them with no due process, you're destroying and splitting families, you're putting more children into foster care. You have created a grifting system with no big contracts and detention facilities in environmentally sensitive areas like the Everglades. For what? For costs to be higher, for no decrease in crime, for churches not having members anymore. I mean, you just created this havoc for no legitimate reason that the people actually feel and benefit from. And so I think it's the ideological shift to some degree, but I also think there's this political shift. And honestly, I'll take either one at this point because the harm that they have caused is so severe that I am grateful for anyone who's evolved in their viewpoint. I just hope they stick to it because I know the political pressure to comply is so hard. And that's why we need to be brave in this moment. And we can't be afraid. As I said earlier, we cannot operate in a place of fear because fear is what gets over compliance. Fear is what gets consent and silence. And we just cannot operate under that banner.
All right. Representative Anna Eskamani from Orlando. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here on The Skinny.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll be seeing you up there back again in Tallahassee. Okay, Ray, we're going to pivot now, but we're going to stay kind of in Tallahassee. We're going to talk about state legislation, which also coincides somewhat and somewhat not with federal policy that's being debated in D.C. And we're talking about one of the bills we didn't talk to the representative about, which was a big one, though, was an election bill that did get passed. You know, every year we have one, okay? We've had one since 2021. After Donald Trump won in Florida in 2020, you know, his supporters say he didn't win in other states. He did win here, but the voting integrity folks in Florida are very committed, and they definitely have the ear of lawmakers in Tallahassee. So we've seen many bills here, and we're going to talk to our next guest right now, who is joining us also via Zoom right now, and that's Amy Keith, the Executive Director of Common Cause Florida. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here with us. So we want to talk to you, of course, about HB 991, which is, I guess you could say, it's Florida's version of the SAVE Act, right, which is being debated. I know there's differences, being debated in D.C. right now, that the Republicans and Donald Trump says, I don't want to do any other bills right now until we pass the SAVE Act. But let's talk about what's going to happen here in Florida. And we should say, of course, this bill won't go into effect until January of 2027. Important to note, because these changes that are going to be happening, you know, are not going to be happening immediately for the midterm in November. But talk to us about the biggest provisions in this bill that I know that Common Cause objects to.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for covering this and also for really highlighting that this does not affect the midterms. It's so important for voters to know that there are no changes to voter registration, voter ID, or vote by mail for this year's elections. But we will see some changes coming in 2027. Also, thank you for highlighting that there are some real differences between this bill and the federal SAVE Act that a lot of folks have heard a lot about. Now, one of the biggest differences between the Florida bill and the federal SAVE Act is that the system in Florida is, as opposed to the federal, which is kind of a front end proof of citizenship thing, you have to submit documents. Florida's is kind of a back end system, you could say. What it's going to do is really rely on the database at the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. So Florida has only issued, Real ID since August 2017. And because our licenses are only good for 8 years, most people who have a valid license do have that Real ID. And what's going to happen in Florida is they're going to look at what documentation you had on file with the DHSMV. And if that documentation is enough evidence of citizenship, then they'll take that and keep that for your voter file. But if you don't, or if there's an error in that database, or if you can't get a Florida driver's license, or you don't have one because you're a student, or because you are elderly and you don't drive anymore, because you're a person with disabilities who doesn't drive, if you can't afford the documents to get that Florida driver's license or Florida ID, or to get that real ID, then what's going to happen is you're going to get a notice in the mail, and it's going to give you 30 days to present documents to prove your citizenship. And if not, you could be blocked from voting or removed from the voter rolls, even if you have been voting for years. And that is the thing that we really object to. We heard it called a poll tax on the floor, and it's true, because the documents, to get these documents, we're talking about birth certificates. Maybe you were born in another state. Maybe you couldn't even get a birth certificate because you weren't born in a hospital. There are people where it is really expensive to get these replacements. You have to get your marriage certificate, your divorce certificate, if you changed your name, to make sure that all your documents match. It's just a lot of paperwork and a lot of cost placed on people who are U.S. citizens and fully eligible to vote. And that poll tax element is really what we object to so strongly.
And Amy, I want to interject here right now, because I know, in fact, I talked to, when I was up in Tallahassee speaking to Ray here on the Skinny, I remember talking about this bill early on the process. And I think one of our listeners wrote in and said, hey, what's the problem here? Like most people have, are citizens, and why would the Democrats or even voting rights advocates argue against this? And I'm going to give you a chance to answer, and you're actually explaining that and saying why this problem about people getting their documents. But this is an issue that when the public is aware, at least without getting the details, does have an opinion. It's what the Republicans call an 80-20 opinion. In fact, there's a new poll just out this morning, CBS News YouGov poll, or it came out, I guess, yesterday maybe, that shows that when it comes to requiring a valid photo ID, which, by the way, we should say is already law here in Florida, and that's not part of our SAVE Act here. That's literally an 80-20 issue, where 80% of people say you should have voter ID. So that's not the question here. But then it was asked, the question is about requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote. Again, this is a new poll which came out at CBS News, YouGov, and it said 66% of people support that, with only 34% opposing it. So when people hear this idea, Amy Keith, they go, well, of course, we don't want non-citizens voting. And if you're arguing for it, like the Democrats are in D.C. right now, like the Democrats were in Tallahassee in the last couple months, what are you guys arguing about? Do you guys want undocumented immigrants to vote? That's what must be what you want to be happening here. That's not where you're coming from. But I do think, right, there needs to be some education on this, because people, when they hear about this, they're like, this is a no-brainer. Why wouldn't people be supporting of this, as it were? And anyway, so please talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I think that those polling numbers make sense, because a lot of us do have a Florida driver's license. A lot of us do have a real ID. So I don't think about how hard it is for some people to obtain it.
Right. I think now, over 90% of people, they say have it, right? And
No, that's not true. They said they did say that, like, on the voter rolls in Florida, 10% of people on the voter rolls, current registered voters, don't have those documents on file. That's over 1 million people, right? That the government's going to say, even if you've been voting for years, you got to jump through additional hoops, and you have to find these documents, right? So that's over 1 million people who are on the voter rolls. They also talked about how most people who have an ID have a real ID. That's true. What they never talked about was how many Floridians don't have a Florida driver's license at all. How many citizens of voting age in Florida don't have the ability to get that Florida driver's license and are already facing hurdles on the rolls. You look at it, Florida's population has increased between 2022 and 2025. Our population has increased over 1 million people, but our voter roll has shrunk by over 1 million people. I mean, Florida is systematically making it harder for people to get on the rolls and to vote. And it is systematic, and this is going to be just a much bigger step in that direction. Now, addressing this, like, you look at this, people talk about the security of our voting rolls and what's, protecting our voting rolls. There is nothing more protective of our voting rolls than ensuring that every eligible citizen does, in fact, have the right to vote, even if they can't afford a document. Now, I'll note that this bill doesn't even have an out. That's how you can tell that what this bill is really about, because it doesn't have an out for somebody who doesn't have the ability to get a birth certificate because they were born in the 1950s in the South during Jim Crow, and they were not born in a hospital. People who've been voting their whole lives but just don't have the right document in this bill, there's no way to sign an affidavit to figure out, that to attest under law that you can't get that document. They didn't provide an out for people to get help to get those documents for free. They didn't even accept an amendment to say that you could get your Florida birth certificate, a copy of it for free if you can't afford it. And that's what really tells you what this bill is about, that this is about restricting U.S. citizens from being able to vote. The other thing that's always important to mention is that, it's 3 felonies. 3 felonies if you vote as a non-citizen, right? It's a felony to sign the form, it's a felony to register, and it's a felony to actually vote. They have never presented any significant evidence that this is a problem in our elections, but we know that the removal of U.S. citizens from the rolls is going to affect our elections. And that's the real election integrity issue here, is this attempt to block eligible U.S. citizens from voting.
And we're speaking with Amy Keith, the Executive Director of Common Cause Florida, about HB 991. That's the big election bill that passed in the legislature last week and is going to Governor Ron DeSantis' desk soon for his consideration, which he undoubtedly will sign. Amy Keith, want to also say, and you're right, and I did get a chance, I saw the governor yesterday morning. I got my one question in, it was about immigration, because I wanted to ask him about this, because I know for voting integrity folks, their contention always is, the election is tainted if we allow one, fraudulent vote to happen. And as you know, it may happen, but it's really, really pretty infrequent. But I would almost turn it around, and say, like, if this is a good bill, if you allow one U.S. citizen who can no longer vote. And we've said this, and I've written about this. I guess the real concern is what happened in the state of Kansas, right, in the 2010s, where they passed a similar law to this, and ultimately over 10,000 people, I've seen statistics of 30,000, but at least over 12,000, they found out through litigation, U.S. citizens who were legitimate U.S. citizens were denied the right to vote, right? That did actually happen.
Yes, that did happen. It's a good friend of mine that happened to, who was not allowed to vote in the state of Kansas. And she advocated in Tallahassee this year, telling her story. This is, these databases have so many errors. We saw that in Kansas. We saw this when Florida has tried to use the DMV database in the past. There are a lot of errors in government databases. There's a lot of issues at the DHS-MV and other government databases, and that kind of error in a database should not prevent a U.S. citizen from being able to rightfully cast their ballot, just like being able to afford a document or not being able to obtain a document isn't. And that's what we're looking at. And again, you can really see the true motivation of this bill because they didn't provide any funding. They provided no funding to upgrade the databases to ensure that this works well. We also asked, the sponsor said on the floor that they haven't even talked to the DHS-MV about this. So I do think that, whatever the rhetoric is about what this is for, when you look at the fact that not willing to provide free birth certificates, even for those born in the state of Florida, not willing to provide any kind of out for people who legitimately can't get these documents or can't afford these documents, not providing funding for supervisors of elections or for the database, and not really talking to the experts who run these databases, you can see that this is really a disregard for the right of U.S. citizens to cast their ballot.
Interesting question you asked here, Amy, from a listener here. Jerome writes in, he says, with this being such a red state, one would think this bill would disenfranchise Republicans as well as Democrats. Yeah, right? I mean, there's more Republicans than Democrats registered to vote right now. We know that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is going to disenfranchise Republicans and Democrats. You know who this isn't going to disenfranchise? People who are wealthy and well off. This disenfranchises the very populations who are most affected by Florida's affordability crisis. And I've said it before, I don't really think that's a coincidence. Like do our elected officials not want to be held accountable by than by the people who are being affected by bad policy decisions, which is making this state more unaffordable?
This bill also will remove student IDs from being an acceptable form of identification at the polls. That is an interesting element. And I know during one of the committee hearings in the Senate, Aaron Grahl, Republican from Vero Beach, who sponsored the bill in the Senate, I'm sure you were watching this. I know you were there for all the meetings. She was questioned about like how the situation is right now on college campuses, and basically did not know how it works right now. I think it was Senator Tina Polsky read from the Leon County Election Supervisor's website about how students can vote right now on college campuses. The next thing you know, they're removing student IDs from the polls, which didn't seem to be really related to what the main essence of this thing is about having U.S. citizenship to register to vote.
Yeah, this bill is really an attack on students, and that is a shame. It is, you look at this, and again, it's because this is a bill about who they don't want voting, right? So you look at students, out-of-state students who live on campus in Florida are allowed to vote in Florida because they're part of that community while they are living here for college, and they are allowed to vote here. But they don't have to get a Florida driver's license, right? So, right now they can register to vote with the last four of their social, and I will encourage any students out there, please do register to vote this year for 2026 using the last four digits of your social security number. And then at the polls, if they decide to vote in person, they can present their student ID with a signature, a valid student ID with a signature and a photo, in order to, all that does at the polls is prove that you are who you say you are, right? And they can vote. Now, this bill is going to make it harder because any student who doesn't have a Florida driver's license, they're going to have to find their birth certificate and all of that to get on the rolls. And then when they go vote in person, they are not allowed, starting in 2027, to use that ID, their student ID. And the particularly wild thing in this bill is they actually removed any ID that wasn't a government ID. And they're like, you have to have a government issue ID to present at the polls if you want to vote in person. But they explicitly remove IDs issued by government educational institutions, which is nuts because you can still use your gun license, but right. You can't use a student ID issued by a Florida state college or university, even though to get that ID from a Florida state college or university, you have to be an enrolled student and you have to have presented already a government issued ID. Maybe you presented your Georgia driver's license. And then, on that basis, Florida State could issue you an ID, but you can't use your Georgia driver's license to vote in Florida. And now you also can't use that state ID. And yes, the sponsor did seem really ignorant of the processes of law behind this.
Now, people always are questioning, like, how is there actually fraudulent voting in Florida or anywhere? I will say that according to the state's Office of Elections, Crimes, and Security, the report that came out back in January, it said last year that the state found 198, quote, likely non-citizens who illegally registered and or voted in Florida. And that's out of more than 13 million people on its voter rolls. They referred 170 of them to state and federal law enforcement for further investigation and prosecution. I want to say before we go here, we got a couple of minutes left with you, Amy, is that this is, again, another, right? Every year since 2020, we've had these really major election reform bills that I guess you would say restrict the ability of people to vote. Are you one of the big ones we had a couple years ago was about voting by mail ballots, right? Where people could get, now they have to ask for them after every election cycle. That is a change here. Do you think that they might reverse that in the future? Because we saw that really did hurt Republican voters last year when they had the special elections up in North Florida for the seats that were ultimately won by Jimmy Patronis and Randy Fine, because they were special elections and nobody there had requested a vote by mail ballot because they knew they had to so soon, as it were.
Yeah, I certainly hope that they will return the vote by mail because it's such a popular way to vote in Florida for Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. But I do want to go back very quickly to what you mentioned about that Office of Election Crimes report, right? Because those 198 voters, they can't even tell us if they voted, right? Yeah. And also that shows that the current system actually works, right? So these people were caught, and also they don't actually know if they voted. They also don't know how many of that was just by accident. And you compare that to the fact that tens of thousands of eligible U.S. citizens are going to be removed from the rolls through this process. And like you said, it's not just this. This is year after year, making it harder for Floridians to vote, and especially Floridians who are so affected by the existing rising costs in our state. And so you look at the whole package together, this is about stopping U.S. citizens from voting. That's what the story is here.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Amy Keith is the executive director of Common Cause Florida. Thank you so much for joining us, Amy.
Thanks, Mitch.
All
Bye.
right. All right, we're going to leave it there, and we're just about out of time here. I want to thank both Amy Keith and Anas Kamani. We really got a full dose of just some of the big things that happened in Tallahassee over the last 2 months. Of course, we're going to continue to go on with that. I'm sorry we didn't get to open up the call. We got one call in here, but I really want to do more phone calls going forward. I think we'll have a chance next week on our show to do that. But I really want to thank everybody for listening in right now. So want to thank Skip Sassy, who's been our engineer, done a great job as always. Anthony, we didn't have him actually. He's too busy back there answering calls, but we're appreciating him being there. And of course, we've got Joe Ellen Schilke coming up in just mere moments with Art in Your Ear. You are listening to WMF Tampa 88.5 FM. For Ray Roa, I'm Mitch Perry. Thank you so much for listening to Skinny. We'll see you here, same time, same place next Friday.